We'll begin with Linda Chalker.
Let me begin by saying no one would describe me normally as a shy person. But when it comes to being a Christian, then I am a somewhat shy believer, mainly because I want to include everybody. And therefore, yes, I will open up and say what motivates me once I get going, but I want to listen first. Many years in local government, first in London and then up in the Wirral where my constituency was, and then more particularly overseas since 1986, taught me that all faiths, even ones I did not fully understand, as when I was in China in 1980, they all have a valuable addition to make to development efforts. It was the huge numbers of people illegally attending the Presbyterian service, which we first went to, and then a huge Catholic Mass in Chengdu in Sichuan province, one Easter, that just delighted us all. It was the least expected experience of 3 weeks in China, nearly 30 years ago. It fully justified our successful but illegal importation of Bibles and the risks we took to encourage action for healthier lives by those of faith who were prepared to work with us. The local initiatives across China showed us then that no faith had a monopoly of care, and those of no faith also could care very greatly. But those who have at times forsaken their beliefs for a mistaken attempt at survival have rightly caused many of us to reassess how faith can build the future. In 1994, my faith was strongly challenged by the role of certain churches in Rwanda before and during the genocide. The herding of innocents seeking shelter into churches by priests and so-called believers, for them only to be massacred, was one of the hardest personal threats to my faith that I have ever gone through. But now to see how faith and hard work has since helped the widowed and the orphans to rebuild their shattered lives all over Rwanda, or indeed in northern Uganda following the so-called Lord's Resistance Army actions, is a welcome reminder of the strength of faith in conquering adversity and helping to rebuild the lives of many. The value addition of time and skills, which are shared by congregations of local churches in South Africa, where I now spend a large amount of my time, has long been one of the best examples of the power of faith to bring more people voluntarily into local government and local development in the townships. Whatever the needs of those communities, it's good organization of all the varied contributions that are available that makes the significant difference to the lives of many in one of the very deprived areas to the north of the northern, plush Johannesburg suburbs. Church volunteers from every walk of life are involved in extra teaching, classes in maths, in reading, in writing on a Saturday morning. It's quite taxing, but it's very stimulating too. They also have been involved in the total refurbishment of a community centre for Diepsloot. They have rebuilt not only the football pitch, but also the banks of well-impacting grass supporter stands. And from time to time, they get involved as referees, linesmen, and even security people when the match is a particularly tough one against one of the neighbouring townships. All these people are bringing new opportunities to the people of a very deprived area, to the young, often in single-parent families or no-parent families, and to the not-so-young who no longer have family to support them in their older years. One-on-one talks about life and seeking out new opportunities by churchgoers from every age group, every walk of life, and every ethnic background have also helped many in that township to come to terms with the harsh realities of South Africa's Rainbow Nation. The xenophobia, which we've sadly experienced, has been openly discussed, alongside the urgent need for real training and jobs, despite the continuing lack of amenities. So in townships all over South Africa, those who do take up the help which is being so freely given are soon beginning to see small positive changes in their lives, and many of them, asking why it has happened, end up getting involved in local churches. Other areas are now beginning to ask for similar help and to understand that giving by the volunteer is adding new dimensions to the locality. The questions to volunteers of why they are willing to become so involved, to give so much time, is also leading to more local volunteering and church going. And instead of moaning, why doesn't someone do something, there is a building of a local community, learning from its faith volunteers, that each can help improve the lives of others. And in recent weeks, we have people from the Muslim community joining with Christian volunteers to work together. And that, for me, is one of the really encouraging things that is coming out of the fairly active activity of the Methodist Church in South Africa. But all over Africa, the building of local schools with the provision of desks and basic seats under a proper roof rather than under a tree, provision of blackboards, pencils, and exercise books, often far away from major cities, is actually giving children a chance denied even 30 years ago to their parents. And the parents come because they want to know what they can do to help. And therefore, this is a very generative activity. And then there are the parishioners who give, build, and teach, and above all, encourage children to learn, often in very materially deprived circumstances. And they seem, by their sheer enthusiasm and determination to succeed, to achieve a remarkable fluency of language and early numeracy in children who were born with nothing. I examine why the church influence seems so much more powerful than teaching without faith. And it is not just the church influence, that's where I'm engaged. But I know of the activities of young Muslims in helping younger brothers in their communities. Now, traditionally, much health care across Africa has been provided through the religious groups. In Bolgatanga in northern Ghana, a charity now run by Ghanaians called AfriKids was actually started 10 years ago by a young English girl of the Jewish faith. This has made a dramatic difference with volunteer help in the clinics, the medical outreach, and the schooling. It was originally funded by Georgie and her school friends, but it's now backed by a wide range of funders. It now attracts volunteers from all faiths and none. It's overseen not by a nun, but by a remarkable local lady called Mamaladi, who certainly encourages real faith in her charges and all who go there to volunteer. And for young overseas volunteers, this Ghanaian community has built a new faith in many of them, where there was little or none before, except a desire to work to try to reduce the poverty of the area. So involvement in development based on faith in people and our given abilities has strengthened the lives of many who gave their time to this worthy cause. It's formed a team of ambassadors for change that no advertising campaign could have done more cost-effectively. I recognise the contributions of thousands involved in development who profess not to have a faith, but just a belief in improving the lives of the poorest wherever they may meet them in the world. They do a fantastic job. It's just that for me, the long experience of relief efforts from Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, Jews, and all others in disaster areas all over the world, or as a result of the war in the Balkans, in the Middle East, or civil strife in Africa, there is just something extra when the volunteer or aid worker gives their service with faith. I think we could better use the services of faith centres too, as distribution centres for food, for clean water, for medicines, and as centres for agricultural advice and inputs. We really should use these resources more effectively than many do today. But I particularly welcome DFID's recent decision to work with faith groups to add to relief and development efforts. It is greatly welcome. So mine, Paul, is a practical message. It is, let's see how we can extend development work by adding our experience of the value of faith to our efforts as planners, funders, and volunteers. I've been very blessed to see the difference in thousands of projects and probably hundreds of thousands of people. I hope to encourage more development through faith. Thank you.
I thank the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and Ian Linden for inviting me to take part in this conversation on faith, conflict, and poverty. The question that our panel has been asked to address is whether faith and faith communities help cause or help solve conflict and poverty. The easy and obvious answer is, of course, they do both. There is enough evidence that they have done so in the past, and we can presume that they will do so in the foreseeable future. And I have been asked to give examples from the Philippines, where I come from, and from my experiences and observations elsewhere. But if that were all I contribute, I would not be very helpful in pushing our conversation deeper. So allow me then to pose further questions. Do we believe that faith and faith communities are mainly positive forces, though they also play negative roles and remain vulnerable to extremist expressions? Or do we consider faith and faith communities problematic, their redeeming possibilities greatly underdeveloped? From the inaugural speech of Tony Blair, I gather that he believes in the first, this positive vision of faith and faith communities. And I share that belief, but I immediately qualify my belief with a line from the Bible, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." Now, to explain this belief and unbelief, let me use the title of a declaration issued by the Latin American bishops 40 years ago, I think between 68 or 69, when I was ordained a priest. They called it "Between Honesty and Hope." I read that declaration when I was young and so much younger than today. To a newly ordained priest looking to implement the social teachings of the Catholic Church, what resonated most was the message of hope. But now, 40 years later, what I appreciate more is the tension in the title, "Between Honesty and Hope." I guess it's because I'm older and also have undergone various incarnations. I'm a former priest, a former rebel, a former political prisoner, a former government official. I don't know what next is coming. So between honesty and hope, the driving energy is hope. but it is tempered by honesty, not only about the situation and the difficulties of bringing about changes. Honesty applies even to the hope that we have, to visions that are clouded, to energies that falter, to strategies that need reviewing, but hope nonetheless. Let me share earlier conversations about faith and conflict in our context. When I started my social ministry after my ordination in 1968, I took it for granted that faith, as I understood it, was a commitment to serve people, especially the poor. I had the advantage that, of course, the theology of liberation was starting to be articulated then, although I didn't read it systematically until I had more time in prison. I was allowed, so long the military said, you can read any book so long as they're not political. So I got all the theology of liberation books from the library. For us in the Philippines then, we had very simple theology. Matthew 25, whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me. That was enough for us. We didn't need a more elaborated theology. A second advantage I had was that, as Paul mentioned, I had the good fortune of being linked to farmers fighting for agrarian reform as a key issue of social justice. In that context, the links between justice, or tillers owning the land they till, and having incentives to increase production, reduce poverty, were well articulated. And though justice needed struggle, organized struggle, we were for peaceful methods of struggle because Catholic teaching was for reforms and against revolution, which was identified with violence and advocated by communists who we considered atheists. In that beginning, faith, serving the poor, pursuing justice peacefully, was a seamless whole. Then martial law was imposed in 1972, and interestingly, it pushed peaceful reformers and armed revolutionaries together, and at the same time pulled apart the unity of justice and peace in our consciousness. Resistance to martial law arose from two movements. In most of the country, former reformers were rapidly radicalized, including myself, and we forged an alliance with Maoist revolutionaries. In Mindanao, a Muslim uprising was quelled, but then a Muslim rebellion flourished. Can we consider that an interfaith dialogue in action, focusing on resistance? It's not what you usually think of when you talk of interfaith dialogue. And yet it was. Leaders of faith communities, Catholic bishops, Muslim imams, cooperated in defending human rights of communities against repression. But the other and more interesting dialogue was intrafaith. And it was among Christians not so much about peace, but about the necessity and morality of armed resistance. We were united in action, but we kept debating. I had 4 students in the seminary who went up to the hills as guerrilla priests, not because I taught them, although I'm sure people equate that the professors are overestimated in their influence. No? One of them was interviewed and asked, isn't taking up arms, even in defense of communities, not against your faith? Isn't it a sin? And he did say, it might well be a sin. But he says, it's a sin that he believed could be forgiven. Another, who was a more intellectual student of mine, said he invoked Luther's Latin phrase, simul justus et peccator, simultaneously just and sinful. Because he said, look, I'm a guerrilla in defending the community of indigenous people about to be attacked. I kill a new recruit of the military. The same act, he says, kills and saves. How do you explain that? Now, a further intra-faith dialogue became even more problematic because there were other leaders of the same faith community who supported violent action against the guerrillas and also against Christians aligned with them, and justified it also in the name of faith. So, we were invoking the same God. Was it the same God? Or is one side wrong? This was a question which, interestingly, I took part in Britain in 1989 from the South Africa Kairos project. We developed an international Kairos project, South Africa and Namibia, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Philippines, and South Korea. Theologians and Christian activists asked ourselves, okay, we are committed to social change as an imperative of our faith, but there are other Christians who accuse us of not being Christians anymore because we have taken a kind of a leftist interpretation of faith. Are we going to take issue with them? Because we tended to be more liberal about interpreting their faith. They accused not only our politics, but our very belief. We attacked their politics, but we considered they were still Christians, only misinformed. That was a dilemma we had to deal with. And we decided that we owed it to ourselves and to the communities we serve to challenge even their very interpretation of faith. However, at the end we said, but could we condemn them? We ended our document calling it Kairos and Conversion, the Road to Damascus, saying, yeah, we disagree, we think you're wrong, but we still issued a call to conversion, saying, well, Saul could become Paul. Now, 20 years later, now, that was 89, we look back not only at the changes that have happened in our respective countries, but especially in the world, and we ask also, what has changed within us? Not only that we are older, have we become any wiser? Even then, in 89, Father Albert Nolan, who was my coordinator from South Africa, said, Ed, we might need to reread the Bible just on this time. Instead of looking at poverty, oppression, we should look at all the issues of economic justice in the Bible. He was already anticipating that the terms of reference will change. Not this dramatic repression resistance, but the more complicated issue of what is a more just relationship in a time of peace and democracy and the market. In fact, that time I proposed another theme for our next conversation, which sadly never happened. I called it Renewing Our Spirituality and Strategy for Justice. It was closely related to the sense that the hope that was in us then was not bubbling with this kind of excitement and energy associated with the liberation, revolution. It was rather a very sober hope, sometimes even somber hope, but hope nonetheless. This is not just a historical reference. Recently, I visited East Java, Indonesia, a rather large group of farmers also fighting for agrarian reform under the new democratization in Indonesia. And a Muslim cleric was telling me, Ed, I'm helping them. And I've been accused by my fellow cleric of being secular and leftist and had to scramble for the Quran to justify. I mean, this whole intra-faith dialogue, I was told by friends in the Philippines, is one message I should communicate to you. Interfaith is fine, they said. The interfaith is necessary, because there are conflicting interpretations of faith and commitment within the faith communities. The current series of conversation, as I read the text of Tony Blair and the other texts, seems to be in a context that is much more global, that gives more emphasis on the globalization, on global issues. And it's also tackling issues that affect all of us, climate change, financial crisis. But the other angle I see is that it seems the tone I have read so far is about people with more power and resources and how we can pull them together and cooperate. I think a necessary counterpart of that is to ask, what about those with little power and resources and have faith? How do we assist them to acquire more so that they will not only have more, but do more and be more? That is the vision of the best development workers. And we need to exchange ideas on how to do this, because before, the issue of justice and peace at the time of resistance was interpreted by us in linear terms. Peace will be the fruit of justice. But then when the costs of the struggle became greater and greater, and victory was receding, we said, could we explore peace as the path to justice? It's easy to discuss the words, but in actual emotions, strategies, what do you do? Now, in fact, my dilemma was that when we talk of global and affecting us all, it's easy to simply say, oh, we're all responsible. But I take comfort and find useful the statement of environmentalists. I think it came in Joburg, where it says, when it comes to environment, we have a common but differentiated responsibility. We have a shared but differentiated responsibility. In biblical terms, those to whom much has been given, more will be required. And I think that is the challenge to all of us. And I don't mean just you in the north. Any one of us in the south who've learned more, know more, are able to do more, we can't excuse ourselves and say, well, all of us have to do our little bit. I have found encouragement in the last words of Tony Blair's inaugural talk. I'm not sure how many of you read it, but at least I read it religiously. Because he emphasized justice. He said, I would argue that the major unifying value needed for global alliances is a sense of justice, and justice universally accepted and decreed. And again, such a view is not confined to people of faith, but the concept of justice is nonetheless possibly the single biggest point of unity of all the major faiths. I find this useful because, when I first came to Europe, my first realization, I told friends, is that I didn't find any Europeans. There were only Germans and French and Dutch and British. And so I did an informal survey to understand their differences. So I told them, look, what is your most positive adjective to describe your national characteristic, what you think you are? The Germans were quick. Ed, we're thorough and reliable, sometimes to a fault. And the Dutch told me, Ed, we don't waste time and words. We go direct to the point. So I asked my British friends, what about the British? They says, well, we think we are fair. When I told the other continental Europeans, I said, how very British. And though they told me, Ed, when you talk of fighting for justice, no, you fight for fairer laws, you fight fairness. It would be an interesting conversation for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. Fairness, justice. What's the precision? My current reading, in fact, which I recommend to you, without any fees paid to me by him, is Amartya Sen's latest book, The Idea of Justice. I don't know how many of you have read it, but I'm fascinated by it, especially read in conjunction with John Rawls' The Theory of Justice. His point is that you don't have to agree on what is perfect justice and peace in order to agree and make decisive action on what is more just, what is less just. And he provides a more philosophical underpinning to what others might see as pragmatic. And yet, that might be the framework within which we were discussing with Professor Harr about how do you pursue peace building at a time where it's not war here, peace talks, and then peace building. No, you push in a period of half war, half peace. That is the situation where we have to learn how to work together. So, final point, I have to talk a little about the Philippines after all. I'm from the Philippines. When I consulted friends in the Philippines, what do I tell them? Because they were teasing me. I said, they're flying you over there to talk for 15 minutes? I said, well, I don't know. They've got money to spare, maybe. They said two things. Tell them intra-dialogue is as important as interfaith dialogue. And I add this. Sometimes some of us can be so committed to interfaith dialogue because we meet kindred spirits from each other's faith. And we might spend so much time liking each other and bemoaning why the others of our faith aren't very good. And we might be undercut and undermined by others who say, these guys, are you sure they're really committed to our faith tradition? Or they're really exploring another new formation, something vague, not partisan as we are. I'm reminded of the image of bridge building. And I was told by a farmer, interestingly, they said, the church can't take side, we are for rich and poor alike. And he says, come on, try building a bridge from the middle. You build a bridge from one side, you root yourself in your tradition, make sure you are grounded, then you reach out and hope that someone else from that bank reaches out. That might be the intrafaith and interfaith bridge building that we have to do. It's easier said than done. The second point, we said, Ed, we talk only of global religions, talk of indigenous people. Initially, whether Christians or Islam, we try to convert them, but he says maybe now their notions of a more integrated, holistic, maybe a more modest conception of what is a good life, what is a community, has something to say to us, even though they're not on the global stage. And finally, the dilemma really, which Paul has mentioned, when I think of myself as a Christian and in a Philippine context, I easily think of myself as majority, how do I do this well, and how do I help the small Muslim minority in the South. I zoom out and I think of myself as part of Southeast Asia. Now I'm a Christian minority in a majority Islamic region. And I ask myself, how does a minority effect change that is democratic and influences the majority? I was told that in a tough seminar on religion and politics in Southeast Asia, a professor quoted Political Science 101, which I never took, that intense minorities are crucial for transforming policy. Intense minorities. Are we part of that? People who work for change. Intense. Now, intense can also turn off. I remember when I was on the run and in the underground, we were dedicated, we attracted admiration, but we also turned off people because every conversation, we wanted to end in a conversion. And that's not the best way to communicate, especially when people are not ready. So I hesitated to work with a Muslim population in the South, even though I was invited a couple of times. The first time I accepted, I was facilitating 100 former rebels and their families to discuss which 3 projects they should prioritize from UN development assistance. And the first day, they were kind of looking at me with a little unease. I guess I had 2 strikes against me. I was from Manila, considered Imperial Manila, the source of their problems. And I was not only a Catholic, I was a former priest, my gosh. But the next day, there were really very friendly smiles. I thought I was a very good facilitator. It turned out they found out I was a former prisoner. And they said, oh, someone like that couldn't be that bad. No? So when I became a government official, I reached out to them and said, look, let's work out. And they told me, we have a problem. When we were fighting, we had dignity, even though now we negotiated. We don't have skills. We're seen as welfare wards. We have what I call an R&R problem. You know the R&R problem? Reports and receipts. They're not very good at writing this stuff. But NGOs and governments need reports and receipts, otherwise you're considered corrupt. No? So they said, what do we do? How do we build capacity? How do we build these communities in a situation of post-conflict? It was a combination of imams telling us, teach us also skills, because I was head of technical education. But also, we asked them, how do we build this psychological trust relationship and also together understand market, because it's not enough to have skills, you must be employable. And they said, yeah, but who would employ a former rebel no matter how skilled? So I said, maybe you need a sponsor who is a devout Christian. These are the practical cooperation that we have to explore in situations that are not perfect, but there are possibilities. The question then I'd like to end with is this. Is it positive? Is it negative? I said it's both. Maybe the question we should ask, in addition to the examples, is under what conditions do the positive elements of faith and faith communities flourish and manifest themselves? And under what conditions do the dark side dominate? I don't have too many answers, but I take consolation in a little book I read 2 years ago. I went to a bookstore and saw an interesting little book that had laws of lifetime growth. I was about to buy it, except it was too expensive, like 15 pounds, only 130 pages. So I just read it. And one of the aphorisms is something I leave you with. Number 10, what is a law of lifetime growth? Make your questions bigger than your answers. It's a nice cop-out for someone who doesn't have too many answers. But I think that is the kind of modesty and mutual searching that might allow us to see each other as friends and allies, compared to a situation where we have the answers and it's just a matter of implementing. An answer has closed a conversation. A question opens new lines of conversation. I hope I have contributed to opening new lines of conversation. Thank you very much.
For the last 6 years, especially working for Islamic Relief, and mainly focusing on the role of the Islamic faith and how we can actually work in poverty reduction and the conflict. And with the question given to us, like, is the Islamic faith as a solution to poverty and conflict? So this is really how I will look into the point from my other previous speakers. There are specific teachings in the Islamic faith, in the, for example, disaster times. It's clearly saying if you save life, as if you have saved the whole humanity. So there is clear teachings and in the disaster, when it comes to disaster, affecting people and creating a lot of loss of life. And there is also, in the same disaster or emergency situation, there's clear teaching saying feeding the needy. And feeding the needy actually here is not only of a particular faith. It clearly says feeding the needy, whoever we might be, just the needy. And there are 2 times, in addition to this emergency situation, disaster situation, twice for every Muslim to think of those needy people during the Ramadan. And there are actually, during Ramadan, there is sadaqah, which is additional charity you give to people. And I can just give an example. For this year, for example, every Muslim is supposed to give like around 3 pounds as charity per person. So there is another time also during the Hajj time, there is more encouragement to give out for people really in need. Then also when we look into the conflict prevention and conflict resolution, there is clear teachings related to mediation between people and how social networks can actually help in resolving conflict between the people. And there is also clear guidelines and teaching on doing no harm. So whatever intervention that we do, we should not actually harm any of the parties in that location or site. Then there is also another part is the conflict prevention. And it's actually by trying to prevent conflict from happening by having appropriate interventions related to poverty alleviations and any kind of sources where conflict can actually arise. There is another part which is related with long-term development interventions to alleviate poverty. And here it comes the zakat, which is a charity in Islam. And every Muslim is actually supposed to pay that zakat. And it's not left the percentage for any interpretation. So it is 2.5 of an income of every Muslim to give in charity for the poor. And in addition to that, there is sadaqah, which is another form of charity So this is officially you have to give 2.5%, but also it's not only said that, encouraging you to give more, if possible, to the needy. And then there is clear also teachings related to the country itself, where if there is oil, that's a national wealth, or gas or gold, the country is supposed to give actually something like 20% of that to the service of poor communities and also the needy communities. So these are actually teachings, and during our work in Islamic relief, we try to work along those lines. Then the other question, which is related to whether the Islamic faith is a cause of conflict and poverty. This is, as some of my previous speakers talked about, it's a challenging area. It depends how people really understand their faith. So the lack of understanding about the faith can create a lot of challenges, and also manipulations and wrong interpretations and abuse. There is also people who might committing an act based on cultural and labeling them as these are related to a faith. So these are the certain challenges that facing any Islamic charity working, and this is maybe also for other faith is true. So this is really my brief comments based on our experience as Islamic Relief.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm going to take the debate again in a slightly different direction. Because it always strikes me that the debates on faith and development generally focus on practical issues. And that's, of course, understandable, and it's no doubt because people concerned with development, like our first speaker and Islamic Relief, and so it's politicians or employees of development agencies, of course, they're concerned in the first instance with service delivery. And in many parts of the world, and especially in the so-called fragile states, this is particularly what bureaucracies and governments are pretty bad at. So what we find is that development people often search, particularly when they come from outside, international NGOs, they often search for groups and communities or their leaders that are able to facilitate that process of delivery. And it's very often in this way that development business has come to appreciate the importance of faith communities. Because faith communities, they deal with people at every social levels, and their leaders, according to opinion polls, are trusted. Usually they're trusted more than leaders of government or leaders of non-religious organizations. And so religious leaders are therefore prized mediators, for example, in violent conflicts. Now, my point is that there is a real danger in that approach. I mean, it's all very wonderful, but there's also danger in it. And the danger, in my view, is that not only faith communities, but religion itself are used as a vehicle for transmitting our ideas to as many people as possible and implementing policies that we have decided upon. And what we risk of not doing is listening to what ordinary and often poor people themselves have to say on what we call development matters, and trying to understand their ideas and concerns. Now, popular ideas and concerns are often expressed in a religious language. And religious language, particularly for secular development agents, is often not easy to understand. For example, and I think a very topical example today is Pentecostals. When Pentecostals in Africa, Asia, and Latin America seem to preoccupied with the devil or with evil spirits, and when they conduct rituals to exorcise these, this does not necessarily mean that they are spiritualizing the social or economic or political problems that confront them. That's often assumed. But it simply means that they're using a particular type of language, a language that is familiar to them, to express their concern about the various forms of evil that they experience in their lives. And these forms of evil include poverty indeed, It includes bad governance, but it also includes violent conflict, and so on. So many people express their concern about these various forms of evil in symbolic acts, such as in rituals. In this sense, and I think that's an important point that I want to get across, religion is a symbolic language. And like all languages, it's a mode of expression that conveys meaning. And as with linguistic communication, we need to listen. And learning to understand the language of religion is in a way no different from learning French or learning German. It just requires dedication and some patience, but it can be done. And I think it's important that when we engage with faith communities, we also learn to understand and engage with them at the level of ideas. Now, thinking about questions of good and evil is typical of religious traditions, and I think we all know that religious traditions are generally concerned with moral issues. Religious believers consider typically good and evil to be part of the human condition. And all traditions, religious traditions, they concern themselves with exploring the nature of good and evil, with the relationship between good and evil, and rather importantly, with methods of keeping the forces of good and evil under control. So for effective engagement with people in the developing world, therefore, we have to learn their language, which, as I'm saying, is of a religious language, and we have to try and understand how religious believers try to take control of such evils as poverty and conflict. Now, religious views of evil and its perceived nature have also a particular bearing on the issue of human rights. And this is, human rights is an issue that's particularly pertinent in situations of conflict. Now, from a religious perspective, it is the spirit that's believed to reside in a person that links the visible or the material world with the invisible or the spiritual world. In fact, what we find is that in a religious worldview, it is the spiritual dimension that is considered to make a human being truly human. And now I think that if I take an example from Africa, everybody's heard about zombies. Now, what is a zombie? A zombie is a person who is physically alive but is spiritually dead. And therefore, it's not a real human being. And so the point of the spirit in a human being that links up with the spirit in the spirit world is quite an important point. And that is what makes, in many cases and in many religious traditions, what makes a person really human. Now, this raises the highly relevant question of what a human being actually is, or what people think constitutes a human being. And that's a question that's actually never asked when we're dealing with human rights, because human rights is really sort of rights talks. It discusses the sort of formal aspects, and it's a highly, it's something that has been really, how would you say that in English? I'd like to speak of the juridification of human rights, so to speak. It's all about rights, but it's not about this other aspect of the equation, the human aspect, the aspect what is a human being. Now, I think Baroness Chalker gave the example of Rwanda, at least you referred to that. What we've typically seen in Rwanda is that people start to kill each other when they were convinced that certain parts of the population were actually cockroaches. Now, what are you supposed to do with cockroaches? You kill them, and you can even believe you're doing a good job, because you're actually get rid of some of the vermin in our societies. And so it's important to think about these issues. And I think Edicio, in his own way, also gave an example when he was saying that, well, as a guerrilla fighter, also from a kind of Christian background, at some stage you start killing somebody whom you see as not quite of the same sort, not as the sort of human being like us. And so that gives you some sort of legitimacy and some sort of justification to kill other human beings. So it's logical that when you consider a particular person or a particular group of the community not as people like us, as real human beings, then of course also different norms apply. So they're not entitled logically to the same type of rights that real human beings have. So, in fact, all societies have these certain criteria to decide who's one of us and who is not. And that's not typical of religious traditions. It's also common in secular traditions. But the point is that in conflictual situations, it's quite common for those who are excluded to be considered as less than fully human. So debates like that are conducted in any language, be it religious or not. So, in conclusion, what I would like to say is that, to wind up, is that effective development cooperation and conflict resolution, as the previous speakers also said, is part of that. That must be built on the worldview of the people concerned, and that worldview is often a religious one. And I think that mobilizing people's religious or spiritual potential for constructive purposes is one of the greatest challenges for development agents, whether they are religious or secular. So I wouldn't like to limit the discussion to a discussion between people from different faiths, or intra-faith discussion, but I think it's very important, particularly as we are sitting all here in Britain or in the Netherlands, in our part of the world, that as secular development agents or people coming from a secular, highly secular environment, that we get beyond the point of service delivery and that we engage with people's religious ideas in such a way that can help transform these ideas for constructive purposes.
Thank you very much.
Listening to all of my colleagues, it's striking the topic for the evening is conflict. What people have talked about much more is justice, rights, poverty, and it comes back to what Paul said in his very beginning, that there really can be no development without peace. But I think what the message, the thread that runs through all of the discussions is that there can be no security in our world without justice, without addressing the inequality and the deep sense of unfairness that people have about the world. So the question then is, what does religion have to do with it? I was drawn from working on a host of other issues a decade ago by Jim Wolfenson and George Carey, who had started a dialogue with the world of religion. I think neither of them had any concept where this was going to lead, but so I was asked to help out on this. And one of our first rude lessons was that this proved to be one of the most controversial issues in the history of the World Bank. And if interfaith dialogue or intrafaith dialogue is difficult, I think it's nothing compared with the dialogue between the non-religious, the secular, and the religious. Over the past decade, there have been a lot of changes. There's been 9/11, there's been an enormous preoccupation with the tensions with the whole world of Islam, a new sense of what people call the resurgence of religion. It's something that can't be mistaken, and wise people, including Tony Blair, but also Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton, have said many times that if we had paid more attention to religion and the Camp David agreements, in development work, in thinking about debt, in thinking about virtually every issue, I say from AIDS to zebras, we would have done better. There's an American journalist who wrote a piece called The Confessions of a Recovering Secularist. And essentially, it is almost conventional wisdom now that without taking religion into account, you're missing a large part of reality. But then you come to the next question, which is what do you do with it? What do you do with this insight? Because the next step is that the world of religion, and that's what we're grappling with here tonight, is ferociously complex, which is hardly surprising since it's several millennia of history. It's maybe 6-7 billion people, thousands of institutions, etc. So I think that we need to have a sober recognition, all of us, of the complexity and what Gerrie is talking about, the willingness to listen and to learn. But to come back to the topic of tonight, conflict, I thought I would at least put 4 ideas of areas where I think there's a great deal that can be done and that needs to be done in terms of linking these 2 issues of peace and poverty, of security and justice and fairness. The development world is preoccupied increasingly with the issue of failed states, of weak states. And if there's one thing that's obvious, it is that religion is even more important in that group of countries than it is in any other. In many cases, it's all that's left, whether we're talking about DRC, whether we're talking about many regions of countries. It is inescapable. It is complex, but it is inescapable. So focusing on how you think about the issues of weak and failing states and learning about and working with the forces of religion in those countries, I think is immensely important. A second area that I think is important to stress is that if there's one thing we've learned about development programs, it is how easily they can be undermined, whether it's in Indonesia, Philippines, Nigeria, anywhere, by poor administration and by corruption. And to my mind, the faith communities and faith leaders should be a fundamental part of the movement for global integrity. They are not at this stage. There are individuals who are courageous, but they're not as present as one would expect. And I have various hypotheses for this, including that they're not quite sure what to do, that they don't have the toolkit, various other explanations. They see the tension between North and South played out in the anti-corruption battles. But I think it's an area we can do a great deal about. And it is so fundamental, the questions of good governance, to being able to address all of the issues of justice and fighting poverty, that I think that it's a major area to investigate. A third, and I think I'll stop there, is one where I think a thoughtful and a careful dialogue is essential, and that's on gender issues. I am very uneasy to see the qualified support among many religious communities for human rights that seems to have at least some linkage to the issues of gender. There's a recent book in the United States by Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Woden called The Half the Sky. And it has a chapter that's called The God Gulf. And it is essentially about the tensions that there are between people of such good intentions around particularly issues of reproduction and the role of women. But this is an area where there should be a thoughtful engagement, and there needs to be action in order to move forward.